Okay, I'm Chris Sandbrook from the Department of Geography here at the University of Cambridge, and the aim of this video today is to introduce you to the Future of Conservation Survey project and the new GOFOX tool which we've developed. So I'm just going to give you initially a quick overview of what we'll be talking about in this video. I'll begin by telling you a bit about the new conservation debate, some background to the issues that have been under discussion in conservation in the last few years. We'll then look at the Future of Conservation Survey in more detail, what this project is and what we've been trying to do with it, some of the results of our research. And then at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about the group and organisation Future of Conservation Survey, or GOFOX, which is our new tool which we're launching at the moment. So to begin with a bit of an overview of the so-called new conservation debate. So there have been long-standing debates in conservation about what, why and how to conserve, some really big questions that are fundamental to the whole practice of conservation. Some of the themes that have recurred in these debates over the decades include the relationship between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. So should conservation be primarily for the benefit of people, or should it be about conserving nature for nature's sake? There have been debates about the role of markets and the relationship between conservation and capitalism. Should conservation be making use of market-based tools, or should it actually be acting in opposition to capitalism? And then there have been debates about the value of pristine nature. Should we be trying to protect completely intact wilderness ecosystems, or should we be thinking about conservation in a much more holistic way, including in lived-in landscapes from a human perspective?
So the new conservation in a bit more detail dates back to this 2012 paper published by Peter Careva at the Nature Conservancy and Michel Marvier at the University of Santa Clara. They published a manifesto about what they termed the new conservation to update some of the thinking, sort of foundational thinking in conservation biology, and try and equip it for what they saw as 21st century challenges in conservation. So they made a number of points within their argument for the new conservation that that they sort of presented as a new manifesto, if you like, for conservation. Arguing firstly that pristine nature doesn't exist in these times we live in, called the Anthropocene. Secondly, that conservation must occur within human-altered landscapes. So it must move outside of protected areas and work in multifunctional and human-dominated landscapes as well as in protected areas. They argued that the fates of nature and people are profoundly intertwined, and increasingly we need to think about anthropocentric considerations in designing conservation interventions. And linked to that, they argued that conservation will only be a durable success if it's supported by people, and particularly local people who are affected by conservation interventions. They sought to reconcile environmental and economistic thinking, and argue that we needed to make visible monetary values for nature, and increasingly to work with corporations in line with economic values of nature, and engage corporations within conservation strategies in order to raise finance and to potentially change the practice of corporations towards conservation agendas as well. So these are the 6 points that were key to the new conservation manifesto.
In response to the new conservation, a series of other conservationists put through a response to critique and offer an alternative vision for conservation in the 21st century. And they provided a rebuttal of each of the postulates that have been put forward under the new conservation. And the first argument that they made is that there are still important areas that are relatively untouched within the world, and these have intense conservation value. They also argued against getting into bed with capitalism, arguing that capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with biodiversity conservation. Capitalism is focused on eternal growth that ignores fundamental planetary limits. They also argued that nature is actually much more fragile than the kind of beliefs that have been put forward within the new conservation vision. And they argued that the fundamental vision of conservation is that conservationists should do conservation. That it should focus on the benefits of nature for its own sake rather than what it can do for humans.
In response to the reply from the traditional conservation movement, the new conservationists sought to clarify a number of their positions and to some extent sought to defuse some of the acrimony that had grown up around these debates. They clarified that new conservation was an expansion of approaches rather than necessarily being seen as an alternative. So they were happy to promote a world where we're using different conservation strategies in different places in relation to context. So protected areas, entirely reasonable strategy in many places, but we needed also to think beyond those possibilities in other areas. They also argued that it was they saw themselves as pragmatists and that this was a strategy rather than a kind of ethical statement. And they, I guess by extension, to some extent, argued that the traditional conservation movement wasn't sufficiently pragmatic in the face of 21st century challenges, Anthropocene challenges for conservation.
The debate itself has received a number of criticisms. For example, it's been claimed that there's very little which is new in new conservation, and rather the debate repeats what are in fact very old disputes in conservation. It has also been claimed that this binary appearance of new conservation versus traditional conservation leaves out other important viewpoints. For example, critical social science, which, like new conservation, focuses on emphasizing human-centered values, but unlike new conservation, is skeptical of capitalist interventions. The debate has also been criticized for the narrow demographics of its participants, who are mostly white, mostly North American, and in general hold relatively senior positions. And finally, the debate has been criticized for being conducted in an extensively acrimonious and hostile tone.
So given this background, my colleagues and I wanted to do some research that would look in more detail at the views on these same questions that are held by the wider conservation community beyond this narrow group that have been leading the debate that I've described. And to do that, we've developed what we call the Future of Conservation survey. So this aims to capture the views of the conservation community on these issues on a much wider group of people, and to broaden the range of voices that are heard, and to look at whether there are differences between these different groups, and not just to enable more people to participate, but to look at whether there are differences between people with different demographic characteristics and backgrounds. And we hope that through this it will encourage self-reflection among conservationists to think more about their own values and their own beliefs, and to think about how those might differ from those held by other people, and through that to foster some more productive and meaningful conversations about the way that conservation should go in the future.
So we launched a survey that had 38 statements that were directly derived from the literature on the new conservation debate. We went quite methodically through that literature and generated these statements that characterise these debates. To that we added a number of demographic questions about age, gender, nationality, seniority of conservation position. And we subsequently, although the original survey was published in English, we have more recently added versions in Spanish and French, and that helps us reach a broader sample of conservationist practitioners.
We launched this project in April 2017, and within 2 years we'd had nearly 14,000 people responding to the survey from pretty much every country in the world. We have a good sample with relatively equal gender balance, but one thing is that because it's an internet-based survey, it does limit the reach and scope of this project. It's dominated by Anglophone countries, and it has a sample that's skewed towards being highly educated.
So looking at how people have answered the overall survey statements, we have divided them up, as you can see in this figure, ranging them from those at the top where the majority of people agree with the statement, down to those at the bottom of this figure where the majority of people disagree with the statement. And you can see that by the shading, the coloured bars. So the dark blue are the strongly agree responses through to the dark red, which are the strongly disagree responses on the left. And in the middle, you've got a group of statements which are more controversial within our sample, where some people have agreed with them and others have disagreed with them. So at the top and bottom, quite consistent consensus among the conservation community, and in the middle, particularly about a third of the way up from the bottom, there are some of the more controversial statements where people have disagreed. So some of the very strong consensus in a positive sense was with statements such as maintaining biological diversity should be a goal of conservation, maintaining ecosystem processes should be a goal of conservation, and conservation will only be a durable success if it has broad public support. And those are the three statements highlighted in green at the top of the screen. And then at the bottom, we've got a few statements where almost everybody disagrees. These include conservation messages that emphasize the value of nature for nature's own sake are more effective than those that promote the benefits of nature to humans. The best way for conservation to contribute to human well-being is by promoting economic growth. So most people disagree with that. And the strongest disagreement of all was with the statement, humans are separate from nature, not part of it. And then some of the more controversial statements, which are perhaps the most interesting to look at, include conservation must benefit poor people because to do so is an ethical imperative. Economic arguments for conservation are risky because they can lead to unintended negative conservation outcomes. Conservation will only be a durable success if it has the support of corporations. So a set of statements there which are more controversial according to our respondents. So that's looking at all of the results statement by statement, which is interesting to do, but we've also done some analysis to try to look for patterns in how people have answered multiple statements. So we've used something called item response theory to identify three broad dimensions within the results, which we think are useful for characterizing conservationists and how they think. So the first of these we call people-centered conservation, and multiple statements that relate to this dimension are all those that talk about basically the role of people in conservation. So the role of people as participants and stakeholders within the conservation process. So the answers to multiple questions that relate to people contribute to an individual score on this dimension. The second dimension we call science-led ecocentrism, and the statements that relate to this dimension are about the role of science in conservation of species and ecosystems, and focusing on doing so for their own sake, so in terms of an ecocentric motivation for conservation. So there's a set of statements here that are about wilderness, protected areas, nature for nature's sake, and emphasizing the important role of science in the conservation process. And then the third dimension we call conservation through capitalism, and this is about the role of corporations and market-based approaches in conservation. So a set of statements that relate in various ways to that topic.
Once we'd identified these three dimensions, we could then plot the positions of the respondents on each of these dimensions, the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with the different dimensions, the different positions that are put forward by these three axes that came out of the data. The first thing to identify here is that we've identified with these little blue dots the neutral point on each of these dimensions axes. This is the point where if a respondent had answered neither agree nor disagree to each of the 38 Likert items, they would have been positioned on each of these axes. And the first thing that comes up from looking at this is that it shows that most people agree with both people-centered conservation and science-led ecocentrism. And this is quite an intriguing observation, because within conservation debates, anthropocentric views of conservation, the people-centered and the ecocentric views, had been seen as being opposite. Whereas here, what this shows is that people are both ecocentric and anthropocentric at the same time. And only a very small number of respondents were not in some way anthropocentric or ecocentric. The final dimension at the bottom of the diagram shows whether or not people were more in favour or less in favour of conservation through capitalism. And the thing to observe here is that there's a much broader spread. Whereas in the previous two dimensions, people agreed or were more in favour with each of the dimensions, albeit to slightly different degrees. Here we're seeing a much broader spread where people are balanced between agreeing and disagreeing with these axes and with this dimension. The final thing to observe here is that there's no overall clusters. The new versus traditional conservation debate might lead people to think that there's two distinct clusters that exist, and people might sit within one of these two camps. But what we see from our data quite clearly is that there's a cloud of opinion. There are not 2 or 3 or 4 distinct clusters. There's no clustering, there's just a cloud of views.
We also found interesting and significant patterns between the respondent characteristics and their views on conservation. So for example, in the top row, we can see that overall, women tended to be more in favour of people-centred conservation than men, less in favour of science-led ecocentrism, and more in favour of conservation and capitalism. Educational specialism also provided interesting effects. For example, when comparing respondents who were primarily trained in the biological sciences with respondents who were predominantly trained in the social sciences, we found that those from the biological sciences tended to overall be less in favour of people-centred conservation, more in favour of science-led ecocentrism, and more in favour of conservation and capitalism. Age and seniority had interesting and significant influences on respondent views on conservation and capitalism, with older respondents being less in favour of market approaches to conservation, but more senior respondents being more in favour of market-based approaches in conservation. This raises interesting questions. For example, do more senior respondents gather more pro-capitalist views once they've become senior because of the demands of their roles? Or do people who already have those pro-markets views tend to be more likely to be hired into senior positions?
And then there's some interesting results around nationality as well within these data. Just picking a few of those out. Some of these results need to be understood in terms of the limitations of our sample. For instance, there wasn't very wide representation of different countries within the African continent within our sample, so most of our sample in Africa is composed of South African respondents and a few East African countries as well. But what's clear is that respondents within those countries, particularly South Africa, have a very strong disposition in favour of conservation and capitalism. Picking out 1 or 2 other results, those respondents from Oceania were very much in favour of science-led ecocentrism, and similarly those in Asia were moderately in favour of people-centred conservation. So you could look at all the results in more detail to kind of understand the depth of those, but that's just a brief overview of how some of the demographic variables relate to people's position on these dimensions.
What we found after we launched the Future of Conservation survey is we actually got lots of people contacting us to say that they were very interested in using our survey to explore the differences in perspectives between people with whom they worked, whether students that they taught or colleagues who worked with them in an organisation. And so we thought it would be a great idea to actually produce a tool that would enable people to do that very, very easily. So what GOFOX tries to do is to help those who are trying to inform strategic planning processes and encourage reflection on conservation values within organisations. So we think there's an organisational user group here who might find this a useful tool for exploring their values and thinking about how those relate to questions like their strategy and their mission as an organisation. And also there's the potential to use it as a teaching tool, so to teach debates about what, why and how to conserve, and to encourage self-reflection among students about their own thinking and position in conservation, and to emphasise that the way in which they think about conservation may not be the same as other people in their class or indeed other people around the world. And we really hope that you will find the tool useful and will participate, and we look forward to hearing your results and to hearing your feedback. So we'd really like to hear from you how you've got on with the tool, and we welcome your feedback. And the way to do that is to send it by email to futureofconservation@gmail.com. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch the video today, and I hope you really enjoy using the tool in the future.